Hello, this is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today I am on with Kyle Allender. I am, for those that don't know, I am the Protestant Pope in a way because us Protestants, we're all our own popes, right? Right,
Yes,
Kyle?
yes, we are.
So Kyle did something really, really terrible, a grave sin. He left Catholicism recently, and we're going to talk about that. And we're gonna push him back to Catholicism today. I'm gonna challenge him and give him the best Catholic arguments, and and Kyle's gonna convert on the spot back to what he was. Right, Kyle?
Yeah, we'll see.
He promised. So yeah, just uh, for people who aren't already familiar, Kyle, he's been in the apologetics world for a while now, friends with Inspiring Philosophy and even Swan Sana, and makes all of his other videos. He's got a blog that we'll talk about today, and uh, recently had came out of Catholicism and uh, presented some really interesting arguments that I had never heard before. So I wanted to talk to him about it to get my audience, aware of his thoughts and works. And I think a lot of this stuff is just really, really helpful, even for people that are not really interested in the topic because just the methodology of understanding the biblical text and philosophy is just really helpful. I really like Kyle's approach to it. So how are you doing today, Kyle?
Good. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Could you just give us, uh, basically the gist of why you left Catholicism?
So, last time I talked about this, I was talking with Kevin of Non-Track Catholic, and I sort of gave him at least the hermeneutical reasons why I left. But
Yeah.
initially, the full reasons why I left wasn't just hermeneutical, it
Mm.
was mostly philosophical and then
Oh.
fundamentally epistemological. So, even though there are hermeneutical objections that I have to it, there are also philosophical objections as well as like just the general epistemology of how we come to approach dogma in the first place, how we come to approach what we should believe or what we're obligated to believe as Christians.
Yeah.
Um, that was sort of my initial deconversion. So when I first deconverted, it wasn't for hermeneutical reasons. It was mostly for philosophical reasons. It wasn't the hermeneutical stuff didn't come until later until I started digging deeper into it. Just because like I wanted to make sure that hey, like making sure that if I do leave, like it's actually based on reasons within the text itself rather than
Mm.
just my own philosophy. Because people can fall into that trap, right? So that's sort of what happened, and the reason why I say that is because what people don't realize is that like any worldview, Catholicism is sort of built upon certain ideas, certain axioms, or assumptions that we have to assume before we come to accept it. Um, for example, one of the assumptions that you have to sort of assume is that your hermeneutics is correct when you actually the way that you approach the text. Another assumption you have to bring in is the idea of authority, or at least the authority that the Catholic Church claims to have. This idea of a magisterium,
Mm.
specifically an infallible magisterium, that God communicates through these texts, communicates through a body of people, right? So it's not something that you can really investigate on your own to figure out on your own. It's something that you're just sort of given to, like, here you go, like God said this and this because we said so, you know, um, and just shut up and don't, you can't investigate for yourself. You can't believe in other
Mm.
things. That if we say that God revealed something, then you have to believe it. And of course, when you ask, okay, well, how do you know that God revealed this to you? It's like, oh, well, the Holy Spirit. And then it's like, okay, well, how do you know the Holy Spirit revealed you this? Like, oh, well, because Jesus founded the church. So there's all these like steps that you kind of have to establish prior to accepting any dogma, right? Because I
Mm.
mean, it doesn't a dogma doesn't just come like just doesn't come for free. There's like there's step by step process that has to take place that you need to in order to justify your belief, right,
Mm.
in a certain dogma, whether that's a Marian dogma or let's say iconography. I know Gavin Ortland has done a lot of stuff on that, but yeah, I mean, any dogma that the church teaches is sort of ultimately is rooted back to the authority of the church, like at least the authority that they claim to have.
Hmm.
And of course, once you start to question not just the authority, but the very mechanism by which they claim to have divine revelation, that for me was like when I initially just started to like deconstruct everything um, from like the bottom up, if that makes sense. So like I just literally like started questioning like, okay, why should I even accept the methodology that the church uses to come to dogma? So that was the first layer, and that's like a fundamental layer. And then slowly, after like about a month or so, I
Hmm.
started deconstructing the other layers of that, whether it's epistemological or hermeneutical, right? So I would say hermeneutically, like obviously those are probably going to be like the strongest arguments from a biblical perspective, but I think there are also philosophical worries that I have with Catholicism itself that ultimately led to my final deconversion, if that
Hmm.
makes sense. One final thing I want to mention is what I mean by Catholicism, just so people can clarify, is
Hmm.
just the traditional view, right? The traditional view that the church does have, and that it is an infallible magisterium, that it is literally guided by the church. So it's not just a symbolic or mystical view, it's literally like, yeah, this God is literally behind the church, guiding it, like specifically the Roman Catholic Church, right? So that's what I mean by Catholicism is sort of that traditional understanding. Just to
Hmm.
clarify, because I know there are going to be some people that are like, well, I don't hold to that Catholicism. It's like, okay, let's be specific about what we're talking about. So
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. The fun thing about this is the Catholic world with apologetics and all that oftentimes is very different. So maybe for my audience, we or people in my audience aren't always accustomed to the language that's used, and
yeah.
so I appreciate that, and should be a fun topic. So uh, just for some clarity there, so you kind of talked about your methodology, but what was the first thing that really hit you? Was like that doesn't seem to make sense.
So the initial, I guess, my initial deconversion started when I started questioning at least the arguments for Catholicism. So like certain arguments for the papacy, because I was like, as a Catholic apologist, I mean, I wasn't really a Catholic apologist because I never really made arguments for it on my channel, but I was a Catholic apologist in my mind because like, okay, these are my reasons for being a Catholic, right?
Hmm.
And a lot of those reasons were either philosophical reasons
Hmm.
or they were biblical reasons, like based on Matthew 16:19, like those kind of passages, a sort of hermeneutic that I applied to the text. Now, of course, at the time, I didn't really understand that hermeneutic fully. It only came until later where I realized, oh, I'm actually just applying my like this framework to it. But at least within the logic, so within the logic of Catholic hermeneutics, um, those proof passages make sense, right? It makes sense that when Jesus is talking to Peter, it's like, yeah, like he's giving keys to the kingdom to Peter, and Peter has this authority, and then he gives the keys to the apostle, well, not the keys, but binding and losing to the apostles, and there's this sort of magisterial authority, this infallible understanding of authority that Jesus is establishing, right? And then the whole assumption behind that, of course, is that generation after generation through apostolic succession, right, that authority is passed down, not just the authority, but also the
Hmm.
grace, right? So then, within Catholicism, it's not just the authority that's passed down, it's also this understanding of grace. So, like, literally, grace is literally being passed down from person to person, right? Started from the apostles all the way down to every single bishop and priest that has ever lived throughout history,
Hmm.
right? So there's this kind of like, you can think of it as like a pipeline kind of understanding of
Hmm.
grace. And I thought that was, it made, at least at the time, it just sort of made sense. I didn't really start questioning it until I started really looking into, like, okay, are these really justified in the first place? Like, do these arguments actually work? Um, and then what about doctrinal development itself, right? So, like, all these problems that the church, I know there's a lot of objections that people have to Catholicism, and typically the response to that is, well, doctrinal development, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't really. So initially, I kind of like, when you're working within a paradigm, like there's ways you can try to fix problems. But once I started questioning like doctrinal development itself and recognizing like, oh, this entire concept is literally a later development. It's not something that you find in the in the first century. My question is, okay, if God really wanted to reveal these things over time,
Okay.
why didn't he just make it clear from the beginning that these things would have been doctrinally developed? Like, God, Jesus could have, let's say, written the entire New Testament, right? Or stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's like, it really, like, if you're really going to say that God is really guiding the church in this kind of strict way, right, where we have to believe in proposition A, B, and C,
Mm-hmm.
why did he do it in a very unreliable way? So it was more philosophical, I guess you could say. And then once I started questioning doctrinal development and realizing that the entire thing just seems like a human construct, like when you look from outside the paradigm,
Mm-hmm.
it just seems like a human construct. That's when I really started like, oh, well, maybe it is, right? Maybe God can work through it, but maybe not in the way that Catholicism claims it does, right? Um, and of course, I say this because the church has historically taught, for example, that anyone outside the Catholic Church is going to go to hell, right? Um, and so I started questioning, like, okay, well, why would God set up a system like this, right? It should be plainly obvious to anybody that investigates this that Catholicism is true, right? If it's that sort of essential.
Series.
Yeah. Now, of course, I say this because this is sort of more philosophical. I do have other things I can bring up.
Yeah.
There's sort of epistemological problems, but at least initially, when I first initially deconverted, that was sort of like where I started off at, is sort of like questioning doctrinal development itself,
Mm-hmm.
and then realizing like, oh, all these assumptions that I'm making, right? In order for my arguments for Catholicism to work,
Mm-hmm.
they kind of rely upon more fundamental assumptions that are very shaky. And so that once I started questioning those assumptions, it just really just fell apart from there. And just, I kind of like found a thread, when you find a thread in a
Yeah.
shirt and you start pulling, it's like, whoa, this gets worse and worse and worse. And of course, the other thing I should mention is it was hard to do because when you're a Catholic and you start questioning things, there's always that threat of eternal damnation, right?
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, God, I'm gonna start looking into this, and if I can find the Catholic Church on the other side, then great. But if I can't, then I'm gonna have to go wherever the truth leads to. Um, and I trusted that God would lead me to wherever He needed me to go. So that's what I did, right? And eventually, I just, once I started pulling the threads more and more and more, I just got to a point where I just, at least initially, my confidence sort of started going way down, and then the deeper I got into it, the less confident I became, right? And this was like sort of before the hermeneutics, and then once I got into the hermeneutics, that's when it really just freaking crashed, like down to zero, like just lost all my confidence in it at that point. But
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. So tell me a little more about the being afraid of essentially eternal damnation, because yeah, I could see that if you're told your whole life, and not that this is specifically you, but
Mhm.
if someone told their whole life, hey, if I convert from Catholicism to whatever else, Protestantism or Eastern Orthodoxy or whatever, that you'll be going to hell, then that's going to be really scary and I guess difficult to think in that time period, right? Because you got a lot of pressure there. Is that
Yeah.
something you experienced? Because it seemed like you kind of mentioned that, but then you also mentioned, hey, I got to go where the truth leads.
Yeah. So because, see, to me, I mean, some people might disagree with me on this, but I think philosophy comes prior to theology in a way. So what does this mean? Well, it means like whatever I think about the nature of God is going to be
Yeah.
mostly like philosophical, right?
Mm.
And I don't think that God would create a system where you have to believe in proposition A, B, and C in order to be in union with Him, right? So my view is essentially as long as you are open to union with Him. I mean, a lot of not just me think this, but like a lot of Catholics even think this. Like Catholic theologians, like James Dominic Rooney, for example. I know he would say that yeah, as long as you are willing to be in union with God, it doesn't really matter like what you think or what you
Mm.
believe. It's more about the heart.
Mm.
And so I was like, okay, great, that's awesome, right? But then if you have a system that claims that if you leave the Catholic Church, then you're apostate, right? And you're going to hell now because you don't agree with these dogmas. It's like, hold on, like on one end, I want to be in union with God. I want to
Yeah.
know the truth. But on the other end, you're telling me that if I don't accept your propositions,
Mm.
then I'm going to go to hell. Like there's a disconnection there, right? Do you really think God is that, cruel, right? And of course, if we're dealing with God, we're dealing with an all loving being, obviously. um, why would God care what propositions you believe in? Like, shouldn't it matter like how open you are to union with Him, right? How open you
Mm.
are to His grace. Why should it matter whether you disagree with this or that? Things that aren't really relevant, right? Especially something that's like completely out there, like what's it, like the death penalty or something. I don't know, something
Yeah.
completely like just something that the church taught dogmatically, but it's just completely irrelevant to whether you believe Jesus is God or not, or whether you even believe in God or whatever. Like it just seems like why would God care so much to have all these propositions? Like you have to believe A, B, and C. Um, it doesn't make any like it seems like it's just I don't know like it just seems like whoever created this system seemed to be humans that were trying to keep things together, right, in a very complicated way. I mean that's fine, right? I mean, I don't blame the Roman Catholic Church for doing that. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church has been around for a very, very long time, and it would make sense that it, throughout its history, it had to like absolutize its claims in order to like stay together, right? Um, but of course, that's different than claiming that God is literally involved throughout the
Mm.
process, if that makes sense. But
Interesting.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm really, really interested in your way you would approach the text biblically. Your philosophical and epistemological approach is really, really interesting for me. But the biblical approach is really, really interesting. That's the main thing I talk about on my channel. But
yeah.
before we get into that, I wanted to ask you, when you originally got into Catholicism, what would you say were the popular, the scholarly Catholic figures that played a role in your conversion, your confidence afterwards? So you're continually reading, continually learning, even once you become a Catholic. Which ones really got you up to the point where at one point you were like, "Hey, I'm confident in Catholicism."
Yeah, so I started off with this book to kind of get started, get a good intro.
Yeah.
I also read what's his name, Robert Kuhn's book
Okay.
on a Lutheran's case for Catholicism, which is also I would recommend that. Even if you're not a Catholic, you should still read it because I think it's his case is better than Trent's. But so I started off there, and then I got into like reading Eric Ubara. I didn't really get too much into Joe Hedgemeyer, although I do think like he's a nice, he has some interesting arguments in his book on um, I think it's Peter's papacy or something. I know he's
Mm.
written a book on that. It was, but most of the stuff was what you get from my Catholic Answers, right? So kind
Mm.
of like popular level. Um, and then so that was sort of the main thing. And then of course, another thing I should add is a lot of it was typological stuff, right?
Oh.
So the Peter Lycan typology was one of those that played a role in that, but also at least at the time, the way that I interpreted the Old and New Testament, like I saw all these connections between them.
Mm.
like the Marian stuff, the Eucharist stuff. So I read like Brian Pytre's work, for example. And to me, he sort of presented like the best arguments for at least certain Catholic teachings, right? And I was like, okay, well, if God wants to establish a church, and if this church is supposed to like model the Old Testament in a way, then yeah, it makes sense that he would
Yeah.
include all these typology, not just, you know, I'm not just talking about the Eliakim typology. I'm talking like any typology that Catholics use, right, to show that their teachings are true. And so I was like, hold on, like, isn't Catholicism just like to me it felt like Catholicism was basically just like Third Temple Judaism, right? I mean, I know it sounds kind of weird to say it like that, but that's what I felt like, right? At least when I was the way I was reading it, it just felt like, okay, this just makes the most sense
Mhm.
of what's going, like, at least the typological stuff and then some of the biblical stuff that I came across, and at least some of the philosophical arguments that I had at the time for understanding like church authority and like, well, how do we get the canon? You know, there's the canon problem. And I thought, okay, well, the Catholic solution just is the cleanest solution to that, right? Just have the church just establish it. And so yeah, and the other thing too is like I got into understanding like sacramental theology a lot, and that to me made a lot of sense with, at least at the time, the way that I was reading Jesus, right, within that paradigm. So again, the way I was approaching it was like I was just approaching it as a Catholic would under, or when I mean by Catholic is just like just their hermeneutics, right? So the main thing is the hermeneutics, and the hermeneutics affects everything. It doesn't just affect your reading of the New Testament; it also affects your reading the Old Testament and the typologies that you see between them, right? The connections that you just sort of like get from the text. And it just made sense, right? When you read it from that lens, right? When, you know, it's like put it on glasses and you're like, oh, wow, look at all these connections there. And so that to me was what ultimately convinced me, at least. There was also like, I know Joshua Sijawadi, he had an argument for the papacy at the time. I know it's kind of weird because he's Eastern Orthodox now, but when he wrote that his philosophical argument for the papacy, I thought, okay, the prior for the papacy is not that low, right? And then when you consider all the historical data, like the stuff that Eric Ubara sort of presented, and also there's a book called Keys Over the Christian World by, I forgot his name, but it's written by two authors. And it's like a 700-page book, and it just sort of like quotes all these church documents talking about the papacy or whatever. It's like, it's just, you know, when you're in that paradigm, it makes sense that this stuff is true, right? When you're operating under a set of assumptions and you're deriving conclusions from those. So yeah, it felt very like, it felt like a rational worldview, at least in comparison to the, you know, the alternative like Eastern Orthodoxy or Protestantism, because I thought those were like sort of like the main rivals. So I was like, okay, Catholicism just seems like it has to be true, at least at some level. So yeah, I mean, obviously I applied like Bayesian. I don't know if you can see it, it's Bayes theorem on my tattoo, but I applied like Bayes theorem to it. I did everything. Like I got as deep as I could. Right.
You pulled a Cameron with the Bayes.
I mean, yeah. I mean, at a certain level, yeah. Although I wasn't like, the main difference is that I didn't base it off of like one argument. I based it off of like different arguments, kind of interconnected.
But Kyle, the priors, I can't even make a joke about Bayes. You know, Cameron's like, you know, with the priors, and this makes this like almost 100% true with this typological argument about Eliakim.
Well, that's the thing. So the typological argument, that was like one of the factors. But I mean, there were other factors. I didn't just rely upon that at the time, but yeah.
Well, that's what you're missing. If you understood it better, like, you know, like Cameron, because you know, you should have seen his Excel sheet. It's really,
oh yeah, no, I actually I saw that Excel sheet, and
oh, did you really?
Yeah, at the time I thought it was good.
Yeah,
I was gonna create my own Excel sheet, kind of like laying out the different arguments, but I just didn't have time for that.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, what's really interesting is because you know, it's not like it's not like the stereotypical thing with specifically Protestantism, where it's like, yeah, no, I became a Protestant because I went to church and it made me feel good, when or I was afraid of hell or something like that. Like, you did research and look into all these different popular apologists and even scholars.
Not just popular, but like I went as far as like Eric Ubar, right? So, and I mean, he's not popular.
Yeah,
He knows the scholarship pretty well.
yeah,
So I also talked to Swan Sona as well, and he's one of those. I think he's probably the best one in my opinion, at least the best apologist.
yeah,
Um, so it's like, okay, these arguments seem very rational arguments for Catholicism. Um, and then, of course, also there are objections to other positions. Like there's
yeah.
arguments against Eastern Orthodoxy, there's objections against Protestant theology and the way that they approach it. So I was like, okay, Catholicism seems like it's the winner,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. So I was also hoping you would talk about this thing called a linguistic matrix. So how you apply that to the biblical text. I think one of the biggest
Yeah,
problems just people in the 21st century have is understanding the Bible, which is an ancient text, whether that be Protestants, Catholics, whatever, atheists. They don't understand all of what goes into reading. So could you talk about that? I'm going to put that on the screen here, and
yeah.
it's
If you
just a
want to
really
show
good,
the
helpful chart.
Yeah, so what's interesting is when I was in I'll give you a little background for how I kind of came up with this idea. When I was in college, one of the classes I took was philosophy of language,
Yeah.
and in philosophy of language, there's a philosopher named I think it's either Wittgenstein or what's his name? Wittgenstein. Anyways, I could be saying his name wrong. It's like this German guy, this German philosopher. Um, so
Whatever his name is. Yeah.
he came up with this idea of what's called a language game.
Okay.
And a language game is essentially like it's how language operates, right? It's ways that we communicate with each other. It's like we come up with these words or these phrases and then we apply them to concepts. And that's how all language works, right? Every language is a linguistic matrix in a way. Um, but of course, when you understand that level, okay, so that's the fundamental philosophical level. Well, how does this apply to hermeneutics? Well, hermeneutics is basically just sort of like an application of the language game. So hermeneutics is like your assumptions. It's your paradigm by which you interpret the text, right? It's the rules by which you come to approach. It's like again, it's the glasses you come with to read it. And of course, every Christian viewpoint, like whether it's Calvinism or dispensationalism, they come with a hermeneutic, right? They come to the text with a hermeneutic. And then, but the problem is, of course, when you have a hermeneutic, the question is, well, does this hermeneutic align with the first century? And most of the time, it doesn't. A lot of the ideas, like dispensationalism, I think, is like their ideas are just completely foreign to the first century. But how is it that they're able to have these proof texts? It's because they're applying a different language game to the text. They have this. There's the same words that are being used, but the meaning behind those words are radically different in the first century than it would be, with the dispensationalist viewpoint. So that's sort of like a rough idea of how it works. And what I think is going on with Catholicism is pretty much all the biblical arguments for it, whether it's arguments from tradition, argument from scripture, magisterial arguments, also like even typology itself, right?
Yeah.
All of these arguments rely upon a hermeneutic. Right? And like I said, so you have all these arguments that seem rational within it. And then you go down in the pyramid, you go to hermeneutics, and then below that is the language game of Gentile Christians. So that, what I mean by it's like late first century, early second century.
Are you talking about just like the biblical texts?
Well, not just the biblical text, but the language game by which we're approaching the biblical text. And the problem is, of course, that language game does not match the first century, or at least it doesn't match the Second Temple Judaism. Doesn't match the language that Jesus himself is using. Right. So that's kind of my thesis, right? And once you see that, you can't really unsee it. And the reason why is because it's no longer just about like proof text. Now we're talking like the methodology by which you are approaching the text is now under question. I mean, it's kind of like, this probably isn't the best analogy, but like, I don't know. Okay, let's say you're a scientist and you're trying to like discover something and you're coming up with all these experimental results, and then someone comes along and points out like, oh, your methodology, or you did the experiment wrong, or something like that. Okay, when you start attacking the methodology, like everything else just doesn't follow, right? And so that is kind of like the main thing that's going on here. Is I think that the methodology by which Catholics are approaching the text is just fundamentally wrong. It just fundamentally does not match Second Temple Judaism.
Yeah.
And how they would have understood the text and what it's saying. If that makes sense.
The example I really like is if you think about a meme today, the jokes with the pictures on it, and, to understand said meme, if you're a geezer like me and Kyle here, you're not one of those hip 15-year-old kids in high school. I don't know, or 15-year-olds in high school. I don't know, but whatever part of school and education you are, you have this meme and you make this joke. It says something about skibbity on it, and you're like, if you're me and Kyle, we don't have any idea what this skibbity is. Okay, if we're looking at a meme 2,000 years later, we're certainly not going to know what skibbity is. Okay, so when we're looking back at this, we have to understand how these 15-year-old kids are looking at this meme, the references to Fortnite and Minecraft, to understand this use of the word skibbity and understand the joke of the meme. And what you're essentially saying is that when a lot of these Catholic arguments, when they look at the biblical text, is that they're looking at the meme from 2,000 years in advance and interpreting it from their perspective, not even trying to understand what skibbity means, right?
Yeah, so that's a good way to think about it. I mean, like I said, it's not merely just misreading the text. It's about the method, the hermeneutics, to the glasses by which you are reading it. So it's actually more fundamental than merely just like, it's not just you're misunderstanding it. It's that the very methodology, the very hermeneutics that derives all these proof texts doesn't, like, it's just anachronistic, right? It just doesn't match how first century Jews would have read this.
And we'll get to some biblical texts, but then there's the whole other aspect of, all right, well, you have some Catholics are perfectly fine. It's like, okay, the biblical text, it doesn't say exactly what I want it to about the magisterium or whatever, but what you didn't think about is doctrinal development. So that's the sneaky guy. You got to remember about that too. So we're gonna talk about that, but I kind of want to get into Matthew 16. So
yeah, we can.
So what would you? So I want to read the passage, and then you can tell me kind of like how Catholics interpret this. I think there's a number of different ways. Oh shoot, what does it start at? Verse 13? Is that a good one? We can just read it, whatever. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus is like, you know what the right answer is. He replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but my Father in heaven. And I tell that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church,
and the
gates of Hades will not overcome it." what is this,
I
like
will.
liturgy or something?
Yeah.
I guess technically, I'm sure it is somewhere out there, right?
I will
I
give
will
you the
give you the keys of the
of the
kingdom of
kingdom of
heaven.
heaven.
Whatever
Whatever
you
you
bind on
bind
earth
on
will
earth
be
will be
bound in
bound in
heaven,
heaven, and
and
whatever
whatever you
you
loose on
loose on
earth will
earth
be
will be
loosed in
loose.
heaven.
Yep.
See, you could tell he was a real Catholic because he said it with
Yep.
me. Yeah.
Yeah. So, how Catholics would read this text is, so start off with, "You are Peter." So then, Peter, on this rock will build my church. Now, so they would say Peter is the rock, right?
Mm,
Then the gates of Hades refer to doctrinal error, right? So that's how the Catholics would understand it. Um, and it says will not overcome it. So that basically the church will never fall into doctrinal error. And the keys in this case is the authority,
mhm.
right, given to Peter exclusively. Like, this is where the papacy comes in, right? Because the keys they're actually only given to Peter. They're not given to the apostles, right? And so it gets given exclusively to Peter, and then whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loose in heaven. So this is just a rabbinic sort of authority that Jesus is giving to Peter. And so yeah, there's the papacy right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where the text. At least that's what Catholics claim. The papacy, you can get it from Scripture.
Hmm. Okay. And so I guess I'm kind of having a difficult time understanding how someone would get this to the Pope is infallible.
Yeah. So the way that they would argue that is, again, you have to apply hermeneutic, right? So
Uh-huh.
then you just you say, okay, Peter is the rock.
Yeah.
Gates of Hades means doctrinal error. There will never be doctrinal error, so that's why Jesus says we'll not overcome it. And then
Mm,
the keys refer to this doctrinal authority, right? And then bound in heaven, which is teaching authority,
mm,
right? And an infallible teaching authority specifically. So the way that Catholics will typically approach the text, right, is that because heaven acts first and then earth, then you get infallibility because heaven can never err, right? So then
hmm,
earth has to follow. So it's not that earth makes a decision and then heaven ratifies it. It's more of heaven makes the decision and then earth just follows,
mm,
right? So then that the idea behind that is essentially like, yeah, there has to be infallibility given the structure of, they, well, at least Catholics view it as a sort of divine causation model. At least that's how
hmm,
I described it in my article.
hmm.
But that's the way that they read it, right? At
Yeah.
least at least more serious Catholics, because I mean there are some Catholics that even would misread it in a little. But if I'm going to be, steel manning the Catholics
Yeah.
here, sure, heaven acts first and then earth,
Hmm.
right? And then, so that's infallibility. So how you get infallibility, they claim, is, well, heaven can never err, and earth just follows heaven. So therefore, earth must also be infallible whenever there's teaching, right? So,
Mm,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah. It is interesting that the NIV puts it as Peter instead of means rock.
I
Yeah.
actually, yeah, well, it's funny because I actually do agree. So, I actually do agree with Catholics that Peter is the rock.
Yeah.
I'll grant them that.
I,
But yeah.
I do think it's fun just the way this says it's like, and I tell you that you are Peter. It's like, wait, is Peter? Is it the first time he's supposedly named Peter, or is he named Peter earlier?
No, no. So he was named. Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, because I know Jesus changed his name to Peter because he used to be Simon. But yeah,
That I
I
mean,
don't know.
it does say, "Blessed you are, Simon, son of Jonah."
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there's a big discussion about like from a historical perspective here, but I don't know. I thought it'd just be fun. It's like, hey, you are Peter. Okay, okay. I guess that's the name. New name now.
Yep.
Surprise, surprise! Look at that. But so I appreciate that. And was there anything about this passage that kind of? Oh, no, no. But before we get to that, could you maybe go more in detail about the your linguistic matrix and how that
Hmm.
apply like from the Catholic
Yep.
perspective of like all these things that are kind of assumed. that when someone comes to this passage?
Right. So, like I said, so for example, if you look at the gates of Hades, how that is interpreted is doctrinal error. And so then when Jesus says, "will not overcome it," the interpretation is that the church will never fall into doctrinal error. And then the keys refer to this papal authority, right? That's how it's understood. And the kingdom of heaven, of course, is just kingdom of heaven, right? At least the way that they would have understood it is like literally in heaven, making decisions, these dogmas, right? And then the church would ratify, or not ratify, but recognize those dogmas. So that is how the linguistic matrix would sort of work in this case, because again, like I said, within a hermeneutic, fundamentally, a hermeneutic is a language game.
Yep.
And so that language game, that's a linguistic matrix. So then when you apply that hermeneutic, you are reading the text through a certain framework, through a paradigm of interpretation. That's what's happening, and that is essentially how Catholics are able to derive all these proof texts.
Yeah.
Right. But notice again, the text is not itself making these. It's not like you're not actually deriving the papacy or something like that from the text. You are deriving it from your interpretation, right? From your hermeneutics of the text. And that's something that, is kind of missed and not really understood a lot of times. I mean, it's because it's not just this passage. I mean, there's plenty of other passages that Catholics will point to, at least indirectly support the papacy, or at least some dogma of the church. And of course, this isn't just it's not just Catholics that do this. Pretty much every Christian does this.
Right.
If you're a dispensationalist, you're doing the same thing. If you're a Calvinist, you're doing the same thing. If you're a young Earth creationist, you're doing the same thing. Every Christian approaches the text with a hermeneutic. That just always happens.
Yeah, and that's why you should listen to me, the Protestant Pope.
Yeah.
So if I'm understanding you, it's kind of like, with the whole skivvy thing, is like, hey, someone 2,000 years later is looking at this text saying, okay, keys, that's something to do with this other thing. But what did that 15-year-old kid made by skivvy?
Of course, it also gets interesting because the church claims that it has the authority to interpret the text, right? So it's like, well, you should buy into my interpretation of the text because I said so.
Yeah.
And you're supposed to read the text. It's basically a circle, right? You assume that the magisterium is infallible, and so only it can interpret the text. And then the way that it proves that it is infallible is from interpreting the text. Right. Now, of course, I don't think it's not that, obviously, there's a more fundamental, like I said, it's not like, because some people want to present it as if the magisterium itself is fundamental, and then they interpret the text in their own sort of way. I don't view it like that. What I say is, okay, what's more fundamental than the magisterium? Well, it's the hermeneutics, right? Because the hermeneutics is really how you can, that's the only way you can show that Catholicism is true from the text, right? You have to approach it from that lens.
Interesting. Yeah, and maybe from a psychological perspective, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but how we come to the text is informed by our tradition, how we grow up, our reading level, the English translation itself, because it wasn't originally written in English,
right.
That's a huge thing, of course. Our translations, then who tells us how to understand something. So, lots of people are, they grow up in one church or whatever, or maybe even a Calvinist church, and then they are told to read it this way. And from our 21st century perspective, it's like, oh, that makes perfect sense. And that makes it there, and then there, and then there. And then it makes sense with babies being evil, right? Because babies are naughty, right? So therefore, Calvinism is true, and it makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah, but like
That's exact. Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
it's just that's the lens that you like. We all do this,
Yep.
so it's not as simple just coming to a text. And just figuring out what makes sense, or or you could be influenced by not necessarily the Pope, but your best Catholic friend, or going to mass, or whatever, and or your own philosophy too. So there's a lot of things that go into it, that it's not just as simple as just reading a text. Any thoughts there before I keep
Uh,
going?
I mean, yeah, you are 100% correct. You cannot just read the text and be like, oh wow, it says this and this and this,
Mm-hmm.
and then try to, like, from your understanding, make conclusions about what the true church is or what the text is saying. Because anytime you read it, right, you are approaching it from your lens. Like, there is. I mean, this is gonna sound crazy, but like, before I was a Protestant or before I was a Catholic, I actually like read Genesis. Like, I had like my own interpretation of Genesis, and it was like this multiverse level thing. It was kind of crazy. And then, like, it's like, wait a minute, like, is this how they would have understood it, or am I just imposing
Yeah.
my own understanding? It's like, no, I'm obviously just imposing my own understanding. And of course, the issue is that a lot of times, especially with Catholicism, I mean, not just Catholicism, but whether you're a
Mhm.
Calvinist or a dispensationalist, like, you're always, like, in this case, right? It's not simply that someone makes a hermeneutic up and then read it in the way that they want to read it,
Mhm.
but it's actually their hermeneutic is being, like, inherited by somebody else, right? It's being
Mhm.
passed down. Um, and so, like, I think, for example, when you read the church fathers, a lot of them are also operating to a certain degree
Yeah.
on that hermeneutic, on that Catholic hermeneutic. And so that's why, at least for me, I do think that the church fathers have some important things to say, and they're good for, like, when we read them in their context, it makes
Yeah.
sense, some of the stuff that they come up with, some of their ideas. But of course, I view them as descriptions of church history, not prescriptions. And so because of that, then, once you understand the church fathers in their
Mhm.
context, you don't have to take them as authoritative necessarily.
Mhm.
You just have to understand, like, hey, they had their own reading of these texts. Obviously, a lot of them probably didn't understand the nuances of, first century Second Temple Judaism, right? And that's fine, right? But don't try to, like, use the church fathers to try to prove Catholicism or something. Like, I'm sorry, but that's just not, like, you shouldn't do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, people. I mean, it makes sense. So if you see, some scholar or whatever say, "Hey, 7 of these people that were really close to the time of Jesus, within 500 years of Jesus, which seems a lot closer than us, right?
Yeah,
It's a lot closer, and they even know Greek. They knew the same. Oh, I guess Jesus maybe spoke Aramaic or whatever, but
yeah, yeah,
the Bible. They could read the Bible better than us today, right? Because they were closer. It's their road language. We only know English, but and a bunch of them, and like with the specific, like the Eucharist, it's like, oh, there's 8 people that there was the consensus in the early church.
yeah,
um, that could be extremely convincing. At the same time, the problem that I have in these conversations is that n- no matter how early you get, even within 25 years, even when you talk about Paul was even looking through his own lens of his own interpretations of the Old Testament that might have differed from Jesus, about how they previously understood law. And you had the Sadducees and Pharisees and all that. Even that in itself was a variation. So, like, for example, a clear example is when you get to, like, the Gnostics, the non proto orthodox people, the people that Irenaeus was responding to. Like, these people were quoting from the Bible, but they
yep.
had wildly different interpretations. Like when they quoted from the book of John, just completely different, that would look wild to us, but they were extremely close, and they spoke Greek, and they were kind of in that context at the same time, just wildly different interpretations. So it's just not as simple as just, hey, we're going to look at the closest guy to the, even though that is really valuable in understanding the text. You still have to look and understand that context, but even then that's not good enough just to look at what whatever the closest guy believed 100 years after Jesus, right?
Yeah, because I mean, one thing to point out is the early church was very diverse, like super diverse. Like people want to present it as if like there is like this sort of trunk tree model where like, oh yeah, the church was like this trunk, and then like it sort of branched off. That is just completely wrong. The early church was more like a branch, or more like a bush, right? So like obviously you have like the 12 apostles, but then like you had different groups of people having their own sort of view interpretations of things. For example, if you look at like how the Eucharist was done in the early church, like they had different, like for example, like they had different orderings of the Eucharist. Like some of them did the wine first and then the bread, or vice versa. They had different like emphasis, right? And they certainly, obviously, like every scholar, every historian agrees with this, but like obviously they weren't. It wasn't like Latin Mass. It was more like, hey, let's just sit down and have a meal, right? Like let's get some wine and bread and just eat, right? That was how the original church operated. Like, and there's of course there's different practices around how that was understood. Um, but once you have that in mind, you understand. Once you really understand that the early church, like the early church, was like super diverse, you're like, wait a minute, all these people had different views. They were all super early, but yet, like, we're only like, why are we only talking about like, what this line of people, thought or taught, right? Not to say that they're wrong. So I'm not saying
Yeah.
that those other groups, right, are correct and the orthodox view is wrong. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying like we have to understand that early Christianity was super diverse, right?
Hmm.
So you can't just like point to like, oh yeah, I don't know if I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah. Yeah. I could talk hours about this. It's a pet peeve of mine. But uh, so you mentioned like, hey, uh, actually, I forgot what you were going to say, but a lot of people would take what you say and be like, yeah, but what you didn't think about, what you didn't think about is that God said he would guide the church. So, uh, you know, the in John 14:26, John 16:13, that the Spirit will teach you all things and guide you into all truth. And people will interpret this as divine guarantees of doctrinal infallibility. What do you think about that? How do you approach that? Because it seems like if the Catholic Church is wrong, then God didn't confirm that he didn't guide the church. The promise failed that God made. So what do you think about that?
so the way I like to approach that is I'm like, okay, is the essential message of Christ gone? Yes or no? And they're like, well, no. It's like, okay, then. So if the essential message of the gospel was not lost, and
Mm,
if we still have it even to this day, that's the fulfillment, right? To infer that when you say that, oh yeah, the Holy Spirit must guide the church into all truth, to infer from just that to dogma or doctrinal development or doctrinal authority, that's just a huge leap. That's reading way too much into the text.
mm,
um, I think that the way that should be understood is essentially that the church's job is essentially to preserve the gospel, if
mm,
that makes sense. So to preserve the truth of Jesus' message, right? Regardless of how the church,
yeah.
the metaphysical scaffolding that came to be read it as, if that makes sense. But yeah.
Yeah, but Kyle, you see, you're straw manning the Catholics, okay? Because the verse says when the Spirit comes, he will guide you into all the truth, not just the general message about Jesus, Kyle. So, what's going on?
Well, it depends. I mean, what do you mean by all truth, right? Jesus is the truth, right? So of course, like that's just how it would have been played out. But I mean, I get it. I mean, if you want to read it in that kind of way, sure. But then of course, I look at the Old Testament And I'm like, okay, well, does God guide the Israelites? Well, sure, he does to a certain degree, but obviously the Old Testament didn't have an infallible magisterium, right? I get a little bit more into that passage of the article, but generally, I think anyone that tries to like use that passage is just reading way too much into it, and obviously is, you're applying your hermeneutics, right? But I have more. I might in the article. I have more to say specifically on that, because that is one of the objections that people do bring up. But I think anyone that tries to infer like infallibility or anything like that from that is just retroactively reading that back into the text.
But I don't know, Carl, because it says all truth. See, I'm trying to read the Bible, and the Bible says all truth. So, I mean, yeah, people should check out the article. I did find something interesting in that you said that this idea that it guarantees infallibility presupposes that truth is something that is handed down in a form that cannot be mistaken or misapplied. But this is neither how the Spirit operates in Scripture or God has historically interacted with his people. So,
yeah,
maybe you could talk a little bit more about this. So, truth handed down in a form that cannot be mistaken or misapplied. So I guess with this idea of truth is like, yeah, you're gonna what your I guess your interpretation is, hey, the truth, it's true and it exists, but it doesn't mean that it can't be misunderstood and it can't be misapplied. I think for me, it's like, well, no matter what happens, Catholics certainly don't have a claim on all truth. That's not something they claimed in general at all. Like, whether that be specifically about science or even the Bible itself. Like, there's debates even within Catholic scholarship or and Catholicism in general. So they don't have all truth.
Yeah,
right?
that's the other thing too. I mean, this isn't like the best objection that I have against Catholicism, obviously, but one of the issues that I see with it is there is no consensus on which teachings are actually like all the dogmas and all the infallible things that Catholics have to believe in. So, for example, and I'll just make this brief, Jimmy Akin wrote a book on, I think, teaching with authority, and he kind of goes over like his criteria, right?
Okay.
Well, and obviously, I think that's a good guide, but the problem is, like, I know Catholics that disagree with him on that. For example, there's Christian Wagner, I believe, from Scholastic Answers. He disagrees with Jimmy on on his framework of understanding what the magisterium is, right? If you read someone like Father Chad Ripicher, he thinks that the magisterium is not just what the councils say or not just what the Pope say, but also like the consensus of the church fathers, or actually, well, not just that, but the consensus of the scholastic theologians. It's like, wait a minute, what's going on? Like, sorry. It's
You're
like,
real excited there.
Come on, like, if you guys can't even agree on what the church, like, what what Catholics have to believe in infallibly, or like the methodology by which, like, it's like, come on, like, I don't know, there just seems to be like so many problems, at least with that, right? That
So basically, what you're saying is, like, this verse is saying all truth, whatever that means, right? And then when you look at Catholics, they can't even agree on what's required,
right?
Like what
or
you
even,
have to know to be a Catholic, the mandatory things, which is the essentials, right?
Yeah, I mean, they can't all agree. I mean, sure, they might be able to agree, like, for example, like, they can all agree that Mary was immaculately conceived, right? I mean, they can get to that sort of bare minimum. But what they can agree on is, like, what exactly is the structure of the magisterium itself. Like, there's actually disagreements around that, if that makes sense. So,
yeah. So that's not necessarily for salvation, but why is that important? That doctrine important?
Well, from a Catholic perspective, the reason why it's important is, again, you have to believe whatever the church teaches.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't believe it, then, you know, you're not a Catholic, or at least you're misinformed.
Mm-hmm.
So
I see.
and of course the pragmatic, I can understand a pragmatic argument for Catholicism, say like, well, wouldn't God want us to have these truths, right? Sure, you can make a pragmatic argument for that. My problem is like, okay, but we can't even, like, Catholics can't even agree on exactly how the magisterium works fully, right? That's a problem. Like there are some Catholics, for example, that reject Vatican II, right? There are Catholics that are sedevacantists. They don't think that, they think the papacy, like they think the Pope has like been vacant since like I think the 1950s or something. It's like, guys, like, what are we doing? Like, what's going on? Like, you would think that these problems wouldn't exist, but they obviously they do. So, yeah.
Yeah. I did like what you also said in your article is, so when you're talking about the context of this passage, who Jesus is talking to in this book, he's talking about the disciples. There's nothing that I'm aware of, at least, that's talking about, hey, this is gonna last forever, for thousands of years, and this is gonna apply to certain parts of in the church, right? The certain structure, none of that. So if Jesus is talking to them, it's like, why would they conclude? Why would the people he's talking to conclude, oh, they're talking about being able to, you know, have truth about all of these Catholic doctrines that are going to be believed forever, right? And more specifically, you say the Johannine context is eschatological and apostolic. It addresses the immediate post-resurrection guidance of the disciples, not the conditions for future doctrinal pronouncements centuries later. The verb guide is derivative and relational, not juridical or forensic, and implies a process of formation and deepening understanding, not a metaphysical guarantee of perfect doctrinal articulation and perpetuity. It's like, that is a lot of stuff to cram into that verse. And then,
Yeah.
did you have something you want to add there before I keep
No,
going?
no, you're good. Yeah, because I mean, it's been a while since I've been working on other things. So it's been a while since I've read my own article, and
It's like, wow, those are some good points.
Yeah. but yeah, because that's the thing, right? When you read the context, it's sort of like, to infer infallibility, it just really breaks down, I think.
Yeah.
So
additionally, Scripture offers no evidence that being guided by the Spirit entails epistemic infallibility. The Spirit leads, but human discernment can resist. This here, this is kind of what we were talking about earlier.
Yep.
It even says this is precisely why Paul exhorts communities to test the spirits, why the Bereans are praised for verifying Paul's teaching, and why Peter himself is publicly corrected by Paul in Galatians 2. Like, that would be really, really odd for Jesus to say that he was going to guide them to all truth, and then there's all these mistakes happening, and Peter or Paul saying himself, no, test the spirits that, or the spirit of truth, test the spirits. That doesn't make a lot of sense if that's what's being referred to, or at least it's a contradiction that needs to be resolved. But yeah, no, I think that addresses that argument, at least. Anything to add?
No, you're good. Yeah, I would recommend people just read the article. I kind of give a more detailed response to that.
Cool. Awesome. All right. And let's see here. Okay, here's one interesting thing. So you talked about how the doctrinal development is circular, because it arises from a language game. It is illegitimate to use the development to justify the system itself. Could you go more in detail about that? I think that comes from this idea that, hey, there are all these doctrines that we certainly don't see in the biblical text. We don't see it in any of these ancient manuscripts. We don't even see it in a lot of the early church fathers. 200-300 years later, it's all these things pop up, all these beliefs. It's like, where did that come from? Because that wasn't believed by the early church. And then, but at the same time, the Pope says, "Oh, it's it," or the Council says, "It's the truth. It's the truth. You got to believe it, even though there's all these early evidence doesn't say it had it in there. It just didn't mention it."
Yeah.
So someone might respond, "What you didn't think about is the doctrinal development. Doctrinal development." And you're saying, no, that's circular. Could you explain how that is?
Well, the whole thesis behind doctrinal development was developed, I think, in this 18th century by John Henry Newman. Um, and what's interesting about that is, like, yeah, this idea itself didn't exist in the first century. And there, of course, at a certain level, there is going to be development, obviously, right? The problem, of course, is that if you're going to use that to establish like these ideas that just are completely foreign to the text, like, I'm sorry, but to say like, oh well, doctrinal development has always been there, and then these ideas just came later, like, hold on, like, what are we using to actually justify these beliefs? Like, so you're granting that these beliefs weren't a part of the early church, but now but now we should believe them because of doctrinal development. But then the idea of doctrinal development itself is a later construct. So you have a circle, right? At least, in terms of like the way that Henry Newman kind of establishes it, right? Because obviously his ideas are his ideas, right? They are not something that you're going to find Jesus didn't teach them, the apostles didn't teach them. So it's not actually like something that Jesus taught or the apostles taught. This idea of doctrinal development itself is a construct. And of course, you can't see that unless you stop assuming it. It only works if you assume that that's what God always intended, right? But once you stop assuming that that's what God intended, then it's gone. And the reason why I mean, like I said earlier in the beginning, sorry, I don't know if my camera is okay. I think it's good. So that was actually one of the when I started questioning doctrinal development. That's like when that's when I really started my deconversion, because like you can only make sense of these developments or these ideas like, oh well, sure, the papacy might not have been in the Old Testament as we see it now, but doctrinal development, it's like, hold on, what if doctrinal development itself is a part of the illusion? It's a part of the the construct. When I started realizing, I was like, okay, yeah, this there's just so many problems here. The other thing too that people don't realize, so for example, if you read, let's say, Eric Ubarra's book on the papacy, right? Pretty much all of his arguments for the papacy are just quoting like what early councils believed, like the first, from the first millennium, I believe. It's literally just quoting like, oh well, these are what these people believed and these people believed, and I'm just like, hold on. So our evidence for the papacy is based on what these early councils believed, but then at the same time, in order for me to like, some of these councils like literally like don't make sense with Vatican II, for example. It's like, hold on, like, so we're gonna apply doctrinal development, and then we're gonna say, oh well, the papacy existed in these councils at some level, and there's all these, even though there's like so many different contradictions, or not contradictions, but like obviously different concepts and ideas that were being developed.
Yeah.
Once you start to say like, okay, well, hold on, doctrinal development itself is a later idea. So what happens when you get rid of that and you just look at it outside that paradigm? Obviously, it's just people just, for some political reason, or through some pressure, like obviously they're just making stuff up, right? Like they're literally making doctrines up to like keep their community together, right? Like to think that God was literally behind like all the councils or something. I'm sorry, but like that's just ridiculous. It just doesn't make any sense once you sort of drop the doctrinal development, and then of course once you see that, once you sort of deny that councils have this kind of authority, then all the arguments for the papacy, or at least most outside the biblical text, kind of fall apart as well.
Hmm.
Like there's no philosophical reason to really accept all this, right? It just like literally there's no reason at all. The only reason why you should accept it is, well, because some dude said so. It's like, so what? Who cares what a church father said, right? Can you derive it from the text? It was like, well, I can't derive it from the text, but it's like, okay, then why do you accept it? Right? So again, we're talking levels of questioning, at least for me, where it just once you drop doctrinal development, everything just falls apart. Nothing makes sense of what's really going on. At least, to claim that Catholicism is literally true in the kind of way that I described earlier doesn't make any sense. Now, of course, it might be true in a mystical sense. It might be true in the sense like, yeah, like the church developed in this kind of way for political reasons, and it brings people to Christ, right? That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. The problem is when you start interpreting the entire thing literally. That's where the problems come in.
Interesting.
So,
yeah. I think So you certainly can't use this doctrinal development as evidence.
That's my point, right? You can't use it as evidence for the papacy because it itself is a later construct. Like, because when you start thinking, like, wait, what actual reason do I have to accept the papacy or any of these things? You start to cut stuff down. You're like, wait a minute, no, this doesn't make any sense. I'm sorry. There's like no evidence for any of this being true.
Yeah. So I could see that makes a lot of sense, but I could also see a different perspective among Catholics where it's like, all right, so I think that apostolic succession is true. That makes sense. I'm going to trust Irenaeus for whatever reason, and all these other guys, and I am going to trust the Bible, of course, because it's God's word, right? And it says that it's going to give us it's going to give somebody all truth, and the Catholics are claiming that they're all truth. So that makes sense with the text. That seems like what it's talking about. Certain interpretation of this and that and this. So you got all this evidence. Whether that's good or not in itself is a different question. And then they'll see some stupid, ugly looking Protestant with his like stupid little vest on a YouTube video making arguments against their position, because that doctrine of Mary, that was the first text we have of that was in a heretical text. Oh, but then a couple hundred years later, then all of a sudden these Catholics start believing it. Well, what you don't understand is that God allowed for doctrinal development. So like it's an explanation for it's one possible explanation for how God would allow something. So a Catholic like that I would assume that there are some Catholics that don't consider the what's the word doctrinal development that's not the evidence itself, maybe to a lot of people. It's the explanation for how God would do something, how we can make sense out of this while also seeing Catholicism as true. But of course, I think it's kind of like in apologetics where like you have this thing where that sure looks like a problem for your literal reading of Daniel 7:10. I don't know what that verse says, but it's like that contradicts with John 7 in your Calvinist reading. What I'm going to do is I'm going to choose just this random interpretation because that gets me out of the problem. whether or not, that's the most probable thing, because I already know Calvinism is true, right?
Yep.
So I don't need this other interpretation. I don't need some, like, you know, I already know Calvinism is true. So whatever other interpretation must be right, because Calvinism is true. I know Calvinism is true. I don't have to worry about anything else, right? Same thing. That's kind of what I see with
Yep.
doctrinal development, right? It's
Yep.
just an explanation for how we can get out of some mess.
It's one thing I like to view it as like a kind of like, I mean, I wouldn't obviously like, I don't like to compare Catholicism to like actual like theistic philosophers. I'll do in this case. So it's like kind of like, let's say I'm having an argument with an atheist, right? And we're talking about the problem of evil, right? And instead of me presenting like a theodicy, like a plausible reason, I just kind of like present a defense. I'm like, okay, well, here's some possible reason.
Yeah.
But notice that, I mean, sure, you've created a story, but that assumes that God exists, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a possible explanation, but it doesn't like actually like address the core issue being at play here, right? And so that's kind of like what I see with a lot of Catholic apologists when they talk about doctrinal development. Is it just seems like you have to assume that Catholicism is true first, and then you use doctrinal development as a way to kind of explain away and like read back on the text, right? So I think that doctrinal development really only works if you can first establish that Catholicism is true.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, though, I could easily see it as a way to say, just to hand wave any argument, like, no matter how nonsensical it is. It's like, that's sure, like, it looks like it came from Gnostics, but what you didn't understand was the doctrinal development. It's like, well, yes, there's a possible minute like, it might be crazy. It might be as crazy as aliens, but it's possible that God would want nobody to understand this for 800 years, and then all of a sudden it be true because the doctrinal development. Like, yes, that is possible, but does that seem
I
to fit
actually, it's
with
funny you
how things
mentioned
are?
that
What?
because it's funny you mentioned that because I actually like to compare doctrinal development to like epicycles. So I don't know if you know what epicycles are,
Not a
but
clue.
an epicycle is like essentially like, so instead of I think we all know what heliocentrism is and geocentrism. So geocentrism is where like the Earth is the center of the solar system. Heliocentrism is like obviously the true model. But let's say I'm arguing with a geocentrist. There's a way you can explain like our observations by like epicycles. So you just keep adding more and more in, right? You can always change your model or your theory to accommodate any piece of evidence.
Yeah.
And that's basically what's going on with doctrinal development. It is designed to explain away every single contradiction or any piece of evidence that comes against Catholicism. Doctrinal development is just kind of like, it's an epicycle, right? It's just ad hocly like, oh yeah, this is just, it's like, wait, but hold on, like that doesn't justify why Catholicism is true. That's just making sure that it's, it makes it unfalsifiable in a way. At least I think that's what's going on. But yeah.
Okay, and thank you for that. So let's see here. What else we have? So can the doctrine of infallibility be considered credible if it is neither grounded in scripture nor rationally defensible as a claim that any human or institution is wholly incapable of error? Can you talk about that?
Are you talking about philosophically or just
I got a lot of different questions in there. So,
okay.
I think if I put this in right, I think you said infallibility is defined not positively as the presence of divine insight, but negatively as the universal negation of error under certain conditions. But such a proposition is not only absent from the biblical text, but is also epistemologically indefensible. One cannot even in principle provide rational justification for the claim that any human institution or person is incapable of error. Maybe explain that a different way there. How does that make sense?
I'll explain that. So I'm really in that at least in that part of the article, I'm making a more philosophical point. It's not really a hermeneutical argument that I have. It's more of a philosophical point, which is this. if I claim to be free from error,
Mm-hmm.
or let's maybe not necessarily me, but let's say that we have a model of reality that claims to be free from error. The issue is that model still has to make predictions about, has to a certain level like explain the data. And the issue is like, okay, let's say I have one model that claims to be infallible, but then another model that claims to be fallible but still highly reliable. The issue is that I can have a model of reality that is fallible but highly reliable, still make the same exact predictions, still have the same evidence for it as the infallibility model. The only difference between the models is not the evidence, but rather the philosophical, I guess, assumptions behind them. And the issue that I see is that infallibility as a concept cannot be justified, because any model that it's a part of, is a part of our web of beliefs. There's nothing to distinguish. There's nothing that infallibility itself is going to predict, that a fallibilist model wouldn't be able to predict, if that makes sense. So it's more of a philosophical point. Like, hey,
Say that
like
again. My audience is not going to know what a
okay,
fallibus
yeah.
model is.
So I'm using sort of a comparison in the philosophy of science between two models of the world, where you have one model that makes certain predictions, right, and then there's evidence for that. Another model makes the exact same predictions. What I'm saying is that when it comes to infallibility, the issue is that no matter what, infallibility is always going to be like, it's always going to have an underdetermination problem. Meaning there can't be a piece of evidence that we can find in the world that is going to say that this thing or whatever is infallible, right? In the same way, like, obviously, like when it comes to science, right? Scientific theories, scientific models, they don't claim to be infallible. They are fallible models. They can be revised, right? If the evidence requires it. The issue is that infallibility, if you have an infallibility model, the model itself claims that it cannot be changed, right? It is free from error. And so almost by definition, that model is going to have less flexibility than a model that is fallible but highly reliable, if that makes sense. So it's a more philosophical point, but the reason why I bring that up is because just from a purely philosophy of science perspective, there just can't be any evidence that something is infallible, because any evidence that thing is infallible can also be underdetermined by some other model or some other idea or theory that itself is fallible, right? But still highly reliable and makes the same predictions, all that stuff. So that's, again, that might be more abstract, more philosophical, but that's sort of the main, at least one of the problems that I have with infallibility, at least on a philosophical level, is that, like, almost by definition, because it's infallible, like, you can't revise it, you can't change it. So then if I can come up with a model of reality that doesn't require infallibility, then I'm going to do just as well as the infallibility model. That's basically the point that I'm trying to make there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe just for my audience sake, get into philosophy, not preferred, but here we are.
Yep.
So like, if I tell you that, the Jesus was on Earth, and Jesus was a pretty cool guy.
Yep.
Plus, he was God, and I got this great evidence he was God, and he said, yeah, this guy over here, he's going to be the Pope, and he's infallible. And so, that in itself, if Jesus is God, which I got some really good evidence for it, Kyle, you just got to trust me, okay? And he said that, and this guy's God, and God can't be wrong, right? So that's pretty good. I'm going to listen to whatever Jesus says, because he's not going to be wrong. Why isn't that, like, how does that situation apply for your example? Because that seems to me like that's pretty good evidence for this guy being infallible.
I would say it's evidence, but of course, then in that case, you can have it to where the infallibility model would do better, because let's say I'm the devil's advocate and I take the position, okay, Jesus did all that but then was lying. I could say that, right? I can't rule that out, but notice that now I have an additional assumption that Jesus lied about
Mm-hmm.
Peter being infallible. So there's a way you can get around it. It's just now, the simpler explanation in this case, right,
Uh-huh.
in this example that you bring, obviously the better model is going to be the infallibility model, right? Because Jesus himself literally made that claim.
Yeah.
And we know this to be the fact, right? So even though I could come up with a theory that says that Jesus lied, obviously that's problematic.
But that's the opposite of what you're saying, because you're saying that infallibility cannot be proved.
At least not on. So I should have said. Well, good thing I didn't say in principle, because technically there could be evidence for it, at least at to some level, but it has to be something like that. Like it would have to be like so like indisputable that there could be evidence for infallibility, and then what you would have a weird situation where the only way around that is to claim, okay, Jesus lied about that statement, or Jesus never made the statement. Sure, you could do that, but now you have a more complex hypothesis, right? If that makes sense. So, at least from a purely philosophical perspective, sure, there could be a way in which infallibility could win out, but it has to be like, it would have to be that, like, basically, Jesus would have to talk as a Roman Catholic would in his context. That's the only way that it could happen.
And
Yeah.
why do you have to have that big of a burden of proof?
So the reason why is because if you want to believe something, if you want to dedicate your life to a church, right, to the Catholic Church, then it should, it should have that kind of evidence for it.
Yeah, I mean, specifically in this whole example of like that infallibility being impossible to justify, or whatever you're trying to say. Infallibility is defined not positively as the presence of divine insight, but negatively as the universal negation of error under certain conditions. So, what about this argument that you're giving here makes it so difficult, or requires Catholicism to have such a high burden of proof for this infallibility claim?
Well, so the reason why is because, so it's more of a background knowledge argument. So given our background knowledge,
Oh,
no
okay.
one claims to be infallible, right?
Yeah.
Every person says I could be wrong about this or that, or maybe
Yeah.
I'm interpreting it wrong.
Yeah.
Maybe I could have made that point. I didn't want to get too caught in the weeds in the article, but that's sort of how I would approach it. Like, given our background knowledge, like no one claims, like no one's just going around saying I'm infallible and all this stuff, right? There's typically like, okay, you're infallible, great, show it,
Yeah.
right?
But then you could be right so many times, but no matter how
So
many
that's
right, you
yeah,
could still be wrong in the future, right?
that's kind of the thing, right? Too, is like, okay, even if you're always right, like even if you have like a perfect, like, I don't know, you had like some AI that was like really good at math or something, that doesn't mean that it's infallible. It just means it just got it right a lot of times, right? So even if the church like got it right throughout its years, it doesn't mean it's
Mm.
infallible. Because again, you're making a universal negative claim. It's not just a claim about whether you've been right all along. It's more of like the claim that I will never be wrong, right, under certain conditions. So, yeah, I mean, that's sort of, and the reason why I brought that up in the article is just to kind of like get people thinking about, like, hey, like this whole idea of infallibility just kind of seems very like, I don't know, there seems to be a lot of issues, but of course there are ways you could, like you said, there are ways you could get around it if it were the case that Jesus did something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. Well, even in my example, I could think of problems with it, if that's what I actually believe.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's the fun thing. So yeah. Either way. Yeah, no, it's fun. It's been fun having you on here. That's pretty much all I got for you.
Okay.
I would recommend people check out the article. It might not look like it, but it's actually like a lot
It's
of
super
pages.
long.
Super. I told
Take your
Kyle you should
time.
write a book. Yeah. So
Yeah.
and I put it into my app. What I do is I get like a PDF and I'll put it into the app and it'll say the words. So I just listen to it like in the car or whatever, and it's like 7 hours. It's like what? 7 hours for an article on a blog?
Yeah. It's
uh,
crazy.
but yeah, no, thank you so much for coming on here, Kyle. People check out your channel, and if you want some Catholic content, check out the article. Kyle's going to be pushing on other stuff that specifically in this article he really goes over Matthew 16 and like in very very big detail and outlines a number of different Catholic arguments. So there's a lot of different positions, and he addresses each one. And I think I really do like his approach. Did you have any other thoughts before we get going, Kyle?
Now we're good.
Awesome. All right. Well, yeah. Once again, thank you so much for coming on. People, subscribe to Kyle's channel if you want more content from him. And if you like my videos, make sure to check me out. I interview biblical scholars, and in this case, people who left Catholicism. So, but it's been fun, Kyle, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
You too.